All right, everyone. I've kept you long enough. Thank you for attending tonight. I know you all been patient. It's about 10 past 6. I would have liked to go in a little bit earlier, but I want to first put a huge thanks out to DCTV, all the staff, and Peter Chase over there. They've been extraordinary in helping the public find out about this important time that we're in with these regulatory revisions that are going to impact vast areas of Dartmouth. So, I'm constantly peppering them with texts like, I need something on this. So they're awesome, and they're trying to fulfill all their other obligations and routine obligations. So, big thanks out to Peter Chase and all the crew at DCTV. Yes? Identify yourself, please. Yep, I will. So, I am Christopher Michaud. I am the Director of Public Health for the town of Dartmouth. This is our third informational meeting about these proposed changes. These changes that are being proposed and being discussed tonight are changes that are being proposed by the Mass Department of Environmental Protection. These are not town decisions at this point, and a little further on we'll get into how the town will integrate into these proposed regulations. So many of you are with us for the first time. Some of you might be back for a second time or a third time, and others may have learned and read a little bit about this. So bear with me as I kind of go back and discuss how we arrived at where we are now with these proposed regulations. Mass DEP is charged with protecting the environment by the legislature, and they have to protect the air, the land, and the water. So one of those charges gets defined in 310 CMR 1500, which is commonly known as Title V, that set of regulations, which applies to septic systems. They get administered largely on the local level by cities and towns. A number of years ago, the Mass Department of Environmental Protection underwent this project called the Mass Estuaries Project, where they started studying estuarine systems. Estuarine, what is that? It's like the Slocum River, the Westport River, a lot of the embayments on Cape Cod and the islands. So this green area that you see on the map, which shows on Cape Cod, the islands, and southeastern Mass, and a little bit of Plymouth County, is the focus of the MEP. From the MEP, there were reports that came out of certain areas that they studied. So you can see in the lower left side of southeastern Massachusetts, you see Westport in the lime green and Dartmouth in the the more darker shade of green. Both of those communities have approved TMDLs. So what the estuaries report did was it studied the health of the estuary, and the health of the estuary was measured by certain indicator life, like eelgrass or certain marine life, which could be shellfish, scallops, for example, bay scallops. If they saw that there was impairment, which was measured by the loss of certain indicator organisms and high levels of nitrogen, they would establish a TMDL, and the TMDL becomes a goal by which estuary health will restore. If you can fall below that goal, then there is the theory that estuary health will restore, and marine life that is indicative of a healthy system will come back. So in 2018, on September 30th, if my memory is correct, we met in this exact room where Mass DEP proposed the draft TMDL for the Slocum River. The town of Dartmouth, through the Board of Health and the Environmental Affairs Coordinator, Michael O'Reilly, now retired, provided extensive comments, which you'll find on the Board of Health website, in response to the draft TMDL. We were concerned about the report because of the age of it and a number of things that happened during it and after it. So we'll get into that a little bit later. So, long story short, Dartmouth and Westport both have impaired estuaries, the Slocum River watershed and the Westport River watershed. Why am I talking about Westport and Dartmouth? For full disclosure, I am a resident of Westport, and I am impacted by these regulations as a private citizen. But I'm not here to talk to you about Westport for that reason. I'm here to talk to you about Westport because there is vast area in Dartmouth that is the contributory watershed for the Westport River system. If you live on the east side of Faunt's Corner Road, past Old Fall River Road, you're in the Slocum River watershed. If you live in the Enclave or High Hill Road, you're in the Westport River watershed. So a lot of people may not be aware of these proposed regulations because they're like, hey, I'm on High Hill Road. I'm nowhere near the Westport River. I'm nowhere near the Slocum River. But that is part of the watershed. So the proposed changes to address these impaired systems are in two parts, and they're best summarized by the first part being all septic systems in the impaired watershed have to upgrade to a best available nitrogen-reducing technology within 5 years. Now, if these regulations promulgate, let's say March 1st, does that mean the clock starts ticking from 5 years from there? No. There is a regulatory trigger mechanism in there that DEP may decide on March 1st of 2023 or March 1st of 2028 to designate those impaired watersheds as regulated natural resource areas. Once DEP serves the town with that and they become regulated natural resource areas, that's when the clock starts ticking, 5 years. A town can also select to go another route, which is called the Watershed Permit Regulations, 314 CMR 2100. Those regulations are a way in which the public and we are all being told as a way to spare residents of the bitterness of this upgrade. But that is not entirely true, and I'll get into that shortly. Where did these regulations arrive? How come we're just hearing about them now? The town heard about these proposed regulations very vaguely around June. They told us, Mass DEP told us that they would meet with us later in the summer. They met with us and they gave us a little bit more, but not a whole lot. They gave us a sales pitch about how they would loan residents money and how there would be money to, saddle you all with debt to pay for this. And they explained a little bit more about the watershed permit process as a way to spare residents. But there's a lot of complexities to that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But how did we arrive at all of these proposals? And what they told us was the NSA subcommittee. And what is the NSA subcommittee? It is the Nitrogen Sensitive Area Subcommittee. And that is the committee that looked at a uniform set of regulations throughout proposals throughout southeastern Mass, Cape Cod, and the islands to address these impaired watersheds. I asked who was on the NSA subcommittee, and I had a colleague ask as well. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, but you really need to hear this, so I'm going to have to get them because we're not getting an audio.
File local, but just give a synopsis. I'm not sure
Yeah,
if it's
okay.
gonna.
Lower right-hand corner of the PowerPoint. Exactly.
There and then right there.
Yeah, that one's up next.
Yeah,
One on the
and
bottom.
go at the bottom there again. All right, now moving on over. There you go, thank you.
Anonymous asks, where can we find the list of people and organizations who are on the stakeholder committee you mentioned, including the NSA?
So you would submit a public info request through our website and request that information, and then we would provide you with that information.
So I know that was hard to hear. So that was part of a Mass DEP informational session to the public back in November. And someone asked, how do we find out who was on the NSA subcommittee? And they said, submit a public records request. Yeah, submit a public records request. What's that?
Yeah, hi.
Well, it's disturbing behavior for a state agency.
They're hiding.
So the town of Dartmouth actually, before that public meeting in November, I submitted a records request on August 30th of 2022 to Mass DEP asking who was on this NSA subcommittee and how did you go about forming it? Those records were due under Governor Baker's transparency law under his current administration that should have provided us with records on October 11th, 2022, finally submitted records to the health department on December 7th, 2022. I had to file 2 appeals with the Secretary of State to pry about 30 emails from them. They didn't want to produce it. That sort of behavior is indicative. They didn't want to produce the information. It wasn't this voluminous records request that required hundreds of hours of production time. They did everything possible not to give it to us. And what was the first thing that I found that was really intriguing, and the lighting in here may make that a little bit difficult to read, but that email states, and it's from Mary Beth Chubb, who was just speaking in the prior slide, I need a new contact for the Mass Municipal Association if we think we want their participation. So they weren't even sure whether they wanted municipalities to participate through the MMA, which is the organization of Massachusetts that represents municipalities throughout the Commonwealth. So, what did the NSA reveal? And all these slides, I know they're a little bit hard to read. They're going to be on our website tomorrow morning, and you'll be able to look at them all. If you saw the posting for tonight's meeting, you probably already saw that list. But that was the second most important piece of information from that records request. And what this record shows us is who was on the committee and what affiliate they had. There was no city or town on that list. It was heavily lopsided with environmental activist groups that have a one-sided vision to these regulations. We didn't have any municipality that has to juggle the complexities of municipal services like public health, public safety, general government, public works, public schools, so on and so forth. Not one municipal organization. I had asked before they released this, I said, who was on there from Southeastern Mass? And they said, well, you had 2 people from Buzzards Bay Coalition. Buzzards Bay Coalition is not a municipality. They had a lot of Mass DEP officials on there. They had some commercial real estate associations on there, 2 of them to be exact, Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce, the Cape Cod Commission, a couple large engineering firms that we ordinarily see doing large consultant work for municipalities or large development projects. But again, nobody from municipalities. The last thing I just want to kind of mention on this is that, there's one individual whose name is on this list who said, stop listening to the noise. And when he said that, what was meant is the people that are concerned about how these regulations are going to play out in their communities, how are they going to play out in their homes, how are they going to play out in their neighbors' homes, their families' homes, what does it mean for the overall fiscal health of the community? He was on that committee. He had his chance to formulate his recommendations to Mass DEP as he would like to see. And now he doesn't want you, when your time to speak to DEP, to talk. He's calling us all noise. So, shameful behavior by an NSA subcommittee member and shameful of Mass DEP.
Chris, could you blow the PowerPoint up and get rid of the slides on the left so that everything's kind of blown up? If you hit that little icon right to the left there,
Yep.
just the PowerPoint.
How's that?
That helps.
If you go to the left, it'll get rid of the slide.
Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, go to left.
Right there, perfect. Sorry about that, just it'll help
Yeah.
folks in the back.
No, you dropped it. Okay, all right. So, the committee made their recommendations. Mass DEP, through their commissioner, sent this letter out, which was the kickoff to these regulatory proposals. And in this letter, I highlighted a couple sections because he says, to ensure that timely actions are taken to restore and protect coastal estuaries that have been impacted by excessive nitrogen pollution. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Mass DEP sets minimum standards for state regulations for our septic systems. Those regulations that are good at protecting public health, conventional septic systems, being septic tanks and drain fields, are not adequate at removing nitrogen. Nitrogen removal comes when you install these innovative alternative advanced treatment units. So the minimum requirements do not have that component in them. And now, on June 1st, Mass DEP is saying that we need to do this timely, we need to do this swiftly. And why that's important is that we've known about nitrogen as a source of pollution. We've known that septic systems in the conventional design and the minimum standards are poor at removing nitrogen. We've known about that for 25, 30 years. But DEP's been asleep at the wheel. So why do we have to do this in a timely manner? Well, it's well known by now, it's been spoken about enough, that Mass DEP is being sued by the Conservation Law Foundation, and that's what's triggering the timeliness of this. They want to hurry up and get this lawsuit dismissed if they hurry up and promulgate these regulations. So because they've been asleep for 2.5 to 3 decades, and now they want to do this in a timely manner to make their job easier, they want to punish everybody by throwing one of these two options: the 5-year mandate, or to get into the uncertainties of the watershed permit, which we'll talk about shortly. Elsewhere, he writes, this is not only an environmental problem, if not addressed in a timely manner. He goes on to talk about the Cape Cod economy and a decline in fishing, shell fishing, and property values, and tourism. Now, I'm concerned because he has a greater concern for property values, apparently on the Cape, than the impacts that this is going to create here in southeastern Massachusetts. Because these regulations are going to first focus on Cape Cod. Because Cape Cod has what's called a 208 plan. And that's going to be, by these regs, they're going to focus on Cape Cod first. They're going to take their time getting to Westport and Dartmouth by designating them as natural resource areas. So in the meantime, we'll all live in this uncertainty as to when this day arrives, which way is the town going? And what does that do to prospective buyers of properties? Not, if I'm buying a property, which way is the town going? I don't know. Whenever DEP gets around to it. So I find it's really concerning that he's more concerned about Cape Cod than southeastern Mass, because he's strictly focused on Cape Cod. Now, I've been talking a little bit about these IA systems, and what's the problem with these IA systems is that you're all being told to put them in, 5 years, put them all in, once this trigger mechanism happens. But this is a DEP record that I've pulled and put onto this slide. And it says, with current technology, it appears that the use of IA systems alone would not meet the required nitrogen reductions to restore the health of the impacted Westport River watershed system. But you all have to do it. This is another DEP record. And what's interesting about this record is it says, in the first line, appropriate technologies do not yet exist. So we're rushing to create this regulation to require people, when the time comes that they decide to declare us, but the technologies don't even exist. Now, this creates another problem in and of itself. How would you like to be the manufacturer of the product that meets DEP's IA system that I'll get into this in 1 second. So what is this system that they're striving for? They call this a best available nitrogen reducing technology. Well, what is the best available nitrogen reducing technology? It has the lowest effluential value of nitrogen discharge. Well, what is that? If I told you when you all go home, make sure you drive the lowest possible speed limit. Police officer can stop you for any speed you're going, because it's an arbitrary assignment. But if I tell you to drive 20 and you drive 25, you've exceeded it. So they haven't put a number into this definition in the proposed regulations. So they don't know what they want, and it doesn't even exist yet. But the problem becomes when they find that product, there'll be a degree of exclusivity to it. So you have to worry about price gouging because of the lack of competition in the field, or if there are two. The other thing is going to be the demand on this product also driving up costs, supply and demand. Now, again, I wish we had better audio, but I won't even frustrate by trying to play it. This is another situation where Mass DEP is talking about how can we fulfill this objective of all these systems being installed? Because it's not only the installation of them with the product. Maybe you can hear this.
IA systems installed. Drew?
So, we have to first start with designers, septic system designers. Well, we know there's not enough of them. We know that we need to have enough installers. We know there's not enough of them to fulfill this demand. Falmouth is talking about 15,000 homes. We got 2,000 here in Dartmouth. Not enough designers, not enough installers, we don't have products yet. And then once they're all in and installed, we need people to operate them. So all the septic systems that largely you may have, they're self-maintaining, except every 3 years you pump them. If you have a pump system to lift the effluent up to the leaching field, then you may have to have that replaced occasionally. These systems require grade 2 wastewater treatment plant operators to maintain them. We don't have enough of those either. And they're aware of that. And they don't know what they're going to do yet. So again, unfortunately, the audio is not working. Really disappointed because it's great when you hear it from DEP and not me. You're probably all sick of listening to me by now. This is Mary Beth Chubb, who is the section chief who is overseeing these proposed regulatory changes at Mass DEP. And in this slide here, she talks in the first informational session that they had to the public. And she starts to talk about how can you spare the residents from the 5-year mandate through the watershed permit. So exemption from enhanced treatment requirements, which are those IAs that we previously looked at that said they won't solve the problem and they don't exist yet. So she's saying that we can get an exemption from that if the communities obtain a watershed permit that covers an area and we holistically manage nitrogen. So rather than going after just septic systems, we're going to go after the whole of it. The complexities of the watershed permit process are, it's been told to us by Mass DEP that it requires an intermunicipal agreement. The Westport River watershed is shared by Westport, Dartmouth, Fall River, and parts of Freetown. So if Mass DEP stays to this all approach, all these communities have to agree on managing it this way.
Does Tiverton drop in that too, which is?
They drop into the west branch of the watershed, which adds a layer of complexity because you can't regulate Rhode Island with Massachusetts regulations or law.
But it's still the same thing.
Exactly. So the watershed permit requires a holistic approach to managing nitrogen, and you could go after everything and spare the residents. So how are you going to go after everything? Through sewering, fertilizer, possibly some storm water, and those seem to be the big issues. There is somewhat of a watershed permit that already exists in Massachusetts. It's the Pleasant Bay watershed, and that's out in mostly in Chatham, but shared by Harwich and another community. That permit is heavily relied upon sewering in a densely populated area of Cape Cod. The hard part for sewering Dartmouth is that, you know, we have a plant. It's got a certain capacity to it. We have existing infrastructure that has certain capacity to it. And I'm not here to be the spokesperson for the DPW, but based on our master plan for sewer, I don't see any extensions going to the areas that are impacted by these regulations without significant expenses that would probably far exceed the cost of septic systems. These watershed permits have a 20-year life, and they expect a 75% reduction in nitrogen over the life of the permit. And in a few slides, I'll show you some of the problems with that. But if you can't achieve it, and you're not achieving it, because we have to provide documentation throughout the permit of testing, that can result in enforcement or permit modification. So if we can't sewer, what is the next low-hanging fruit? In the eyes of DEP, going after septic systems. And we're going to have to do it aggressively to get to the 75%. And if during that 20 years, if we can't get at it as we intended, we could face permit modification where Mass DEP says, well, you got to do more. So essentially what the DEP is telling us is that you go option one, you cut off your hand. Option two, you can do it this way. DEP's not telling you to replace your systems in 5 years. Now the town gets to tell some of you who gets to replace and who doesn't. Because if you can't sewer out your town, where else are you going to get your nitrogen removal from? And I'll get into that in a second. So that's a pie chart taken from the Slocum River systems that shows where the scientists came up with the sources of nitrogen in the Slocum River's system. And 43% is in the wetlands. It's natural. We can't control that. So almost half of it is untouchable. And the other half they call controllable nitrogen, but not by a municipality. There are statutes that protect certain industries in Massachusetts so that agriculture, for example, is not controllable. However, the legislator created an act that required the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources to promulgate regulations relative to the application of fertilizer throughout Massachusetts. Those regulations took effect on June 5th of 2015 on non-agricultural lands, and they also implemented on December 5th, 2015 on agricultural lands. I did a records request on MDR back in July because I wanted to see how successful these 7-year-old regulations were at controlling fertilizer, both on ag lands and non-ag lands, and what enforcement has resulted. And what's interesting here is that this employee from Mass Department of Agricultural Resources states the act from the legislature did not create any positions necessary for the enforcement or oversight of those regulations. So it's a feel-good regulation. So we're being pushed into this watershed permit, being told that we can do all these things, and the Pleasant Bay watershed permit that already exists targets fertilizer. But the reality is, even the Commonwealth can't address fertilizer. And we can only address fertilizer on the residential side. Normal agricultural practices are untouchable in Massachusetts by municipalities.
That doesn't make any sense. They want a 75% reduction, but you can only address 14%.
Well, 75% of the reduction of the concentrations of the nitrogen in the so yeah.
But you can only deal with 14%.
We're trying to deal, yes, exactly.
So
Yeah.
how are you going to get a 75% reduction when you're only dealing with 14%?
Right. So that's why they're trying to say, well, the watershed permit is the better way to go. But the watershed permit, unless you have the ability to do vast sewering, seems to be a trap that you may not ever get out of. And then you're in the enforcement jaws of Mass DEP, and they don't care about the financial health of the community. They're saying, you gotta comply. And that's a binding document. And once you get into enforcement, you can't get out of it. You can't say, well, I decided we don't want to be in this permit anymore. Mass DEP decides. So here in Dartmouth, you know, I might seem like I'm a little bit aggravated at times with this whole proposal because to me, this is the perfect storm. This is not just septic. This is a disingenuous agency of the Commonwealth because we've been talking to this agency about the unintended consequences of the organics waste diversion in 2012, where they said all these organics, instead of them being disposed of in landfills, now have to go to compost sites, deregulated sites. This picture on the right is a picture taken from a pond alongside of one of Mass DEP's permitted composting facilities. It's green and rich with algae. If you attended the informational meeting that we had a few weeks ago, I provided you with the concentrations of the nitrogen in that pond, as well as leachate pools. And it was much higher than your septic systems. Much higher. So in 2018, when we met here with DEP, and we also responded in writing, Mass DEP's response to us was Mass DEP acknowledges the increase in the number of composting facilities in the town and the increase in the volume of waste of these facilities since the change in 2012. Now, you want to know how much waste is coming in? About 40% of the volume of the regional landfill that we have called Crapo Hill. We assessed it in 1 year, and we had 40% of the volume coming in to our largely deregulated sites. Crapo Hill has engineering protection, third-party oversight, monitoring wells. These sites, you fill out a piece of paper. You can all go home tonight. You can fill out the form online. You can all be general permit composters. So they also wrote in the middle, apparent violations at composting facilities regulated by Mass DEP should be reported to Mass DEP regional office. Anyone here report any violations to Mass DEP? What was the result?
Nothing. A lot of baloney.
So Mass DEP has had a hand in the pocket of pollution in our watershed, but they don't want to do anything about it. In fact, they're continuing to promote pollution because they just lowered the threshold for the generators. So up until this November, if you produce 2,000 pounds per week of organics, you had to send those organics to either anaerobic digestion, which largely doesn't exist around here because it's too expensive, or to a composting facility, food donation, or feeding, a confined feeding operation for animals. Most of it goes to composting, some of it goes to confined feeding operations. What we know is that 40% volume that I referenced earlier is all coming from outside of the watershed. This is not Dartmouth generated organics. These are organics coming from Plymouth County, elsewhere in Bristol County. What might be coming into these sites from within Dartmouth is immeasurable. So in November, they lowered it to 1,000 pounds. So more waste will be generated and now going to these compost sites. Additionally, to promote the collection of these wastes, Mass DEP is offering grants to for-profit businesses between $25,000 and $100,000. So while they acknowledge above in 2018 that, there's a problem here, they continue to make it worse. They don't change their regulations to model that of Maryland, which has some common sense requirements to prevent the discharge of these nutrient-rich waters from the piles into the watershed. They make it more appealing. These places are profiting, and they don't have to do anything per these regulations. Under the watershed permit, these are separately regulated by the state, so we won't be able to touch them. So this is all falling on the back of you and the town, but those little pet projects like this, through Mass DEP and Mass DAR, will continue to operate as is.
Chris, where did they enter into that pie chart?
Where does what?
What percentage do the compost pie?
We don't know, because no one's quantified it yet. And what Mass DEP's response to that has been, we don't know, and that's going to be the town's obligation if you seek a watershed permit to figure it out and to figure out how you're going to manage that now too.
Only as part of the wetlands, the 40% plus.
Oh, you're talking about the wetlands, I'm sorry.
Correct,
Yeah.
As far as the compost pile into the wetlands. 40%.
We actually tested that site. A septic tank effluent could be between 40 and 60 milligrams per liter for nitrogen. The pond was 90 milligrams per liter in one spot. The leachate piles were 3,900 milligrams per liter and a little bit lower, but still in the thousands. So these sites have extraordinary potential. This process is very unusual. I've been talking about it for a while. I heard somebody say recently that was supporting these regulations, blame the towns for putting you all in this situation where you're fearful of this 5-year mandate because they could be doing more. Well, in Mr. O'Reilly's letter back in 2018, he itemized everything that Dartmouth had done over the prior 25 years or more. It was everything that they expect us to do in the watershed permit. We did extensive amounts of sewering. We had unprecedented land preservation. We had zoning changes. We went from 1 acre to 2 acre zoning. That's why I got hired in '95, was that rush from that zoning change. We had some of the first stormwater regulations. We limited impervious area around lots. We require roof recharge. We've done just about everything we can do to manage nitrogen, short of having done a local regulation, like some of our other communities elsewhere in southeastern Mass and the islands, and Cape Cod, to require you to have done IA systems earlier when you built or repaired. I'm glad we didn't. And I'm glad we didn't because if you'd put those IA systems in and spent that extra money, they wouldn't comply. So those communities that tried to do a good thing got blindsided by DEP. So the process to create these regulations with a lopsided committee and then to ram this down our throats so quickly, absent all of the municipal input that should have been part of this, is a little bit aggravating. We've got some very unique situations here in Southeast Mass. We are being lumped in with Cape Cod. And I've been to all of the public hearings, listened to people speak on both sides. And one of the things I've learned is that everybody wants a better environment. The disagreement here is, how do we get there? The people that lopsided the committee want to get there yesterday. They don't want to delay. And they want DEP to believe that you're noise and you're not relevant. And that's wrong. So, what can you do? Well, we didn't get a victory when the state extended the deadline from this Friday to January 30th. Sorry, there is a typo in there. Nope, there isn't. I'm sorry. To January 30th, 2023 at 5 p.m. Because if we all get complacent over the holidays and we kind of forget about this and get tired of listening to this, DEP has said they want to pass these regs. I could bore you to death with slides and records. I've got a record of DEP that said their schedule was to pass these regs in the next few months. So it sounds like it was a done deal. This whole process was just a check mark. They're getting blindsided right now by the outcry from people. And it's not people that say, oh, we want a dirtier environment. They're saying this is going to impact me. So, I encourage you. There are public hearings that are proposed on the 24th and the 25th. They're virtual by Zoom. If you feel uncomfortable with participating in that style, you can submit comments by June 30th, 2023 at 5 p.m. You have to put in Title V watershed in the subject line and send it to dep.talks@mass.gov. Our representative here in Dartmouth, Representative Markey, has said that he likes to hear these comments that you all are making. I know that the representative and our Senator Montigny wrote a very powerful letter to Mass DEP. And they're listening to you. Because I know that one of the comments that was made to them, they quoted exactly. Rep. Markey has said he wants to hear from you. If you want to include me when you send it to dep.talks, you can put me on there as well. Because I like to read about this too. Everyone has a very unique perspective on this, and the legislators hearing that as well is very important. Because while they've weighed in once, they haven't had a chance to hear from all of you. And on our website, we also have the Commissioner of Mass DEP on there and Mary Beth Chubb. They need to hear from you.
Question: when they researched the water, did they look for coliform counts, which would have...
So this is nitrogen specifically.
Well, I know that, but nitrogen coming from septic would have coliform count, and nitrogen coming from fertilizer runoff and stuff would not.
So if we were looking at bacteria, there can be a number of influences that's going to drive bacteria that's going to make it difficult, because we know that a system built in 1995 or more recently is going to be good at removing bacteria before it enters the groundwater. And that you can get, bacterial contamination in the surface water from a variety of surface sources. It could be road runoff, yard runoff, wildlife, farms. So it's a little difficult to assign it to septic system. Once the nitrogen enters, it leaves the septic system, it largely travels unattenuated out into the end destination. Beyond these estuaries, it'll ultimately be Buzzards Bay.
Does the nitrogen break down?
Nitrogen sits until it's up, until there's an uptake. So that's why the algae will bloom, and then the algae blooms and will impact the eelgrass, which is the indicator organism, and it smothers the eelgrass, so to speak.
So how does my system, so I live off of Highland Avenue,
Yes.
How does my system impact any of this? How does the little system I have get nitrogen, which in the ground, it's leaching into the ground? How does it get into a waterway? How does it get
Once it gets into, so that's a great question because, I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Cape and Southeast Mass are entirely different. Go on Google Earth if you have access to it. Look at Cape Cod. Look at the embayments. They did a great job building out all their embayments. Those houses are wedged in there. Everybody's got a dock. Everybody's got an extraordinarily landscaped property. And they all sit atop a sandy glacial deposit. The Cape is largely all sand. You're up on Ohio Road, there's a good chance that you're sitting on some pretty miserable soil that the glacier left behind. So how does the water table respond to those glacial conditions and then ultimately get out into Slocum River? We don't know. Is 20 years enough for the water at your property to get to Slocum? We don't know.
So, we're being told, as a taxpaying citizen, that we're causing a problem, when they don't even know if we're causing a problem.
Again,
And
there's,
if we do this, they don't even know if the problem's gonna be solved.
there is an old report that occurred when we were undertaking all of the desired, or most of the desired activities that are controllable back in the late 90s and early 2000s. So the results of that, we will not realize until maybe 10, 15, 20 years, which could be occurring now. However, the state threw a monkey wrench into that when it deregulated composting. Is that enough to erase all of the significance of what we did with sewering in Dartmouth? We don't know, because the problem is the data is old. And the way in which DEP has done this and crafted these regulations, the problem is we can't talk about that now, because we fought that fight here on September 30th of 2018, and it was a checkmark approach. You saw some of those comments earlier that they just brushed us aside and said, well, you can figure those problems out later. You can try to get some more certainty to this later.
Does the town have legal recourse against the state?
That's a question that needs to be asked of the select board and, with town council.
Because I'm sure there would be a lot of towns that would participate.
I know Falmouth, I saw their town council at a public hearing with a lot of concern.
So how the deregulation of those composting facilities, that's done by the state?
Yes.
We have no recourse to that? We can't say, we don't want that.
So we're in the,
Because they've done it in the watersheds, like all those pictures you put in, thank you for doing that. There's so many pictures of all the horrible looking places that
yeah.
water.
So we've done some records requests on the state that we are looking at extracting as part of our response to these proposed regulations. And I haven't had a chance to write about this aspect yet. But I asked, where are your groundwater discharge permits for your compost sites? None. Have you done any testing? No. So DEP, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, but you have a law that is Mass General Laws, Chapter 21A, Section 2, Paragraph 10, that the legislator said, DEP, you need to protect the environment, land, the air, the water.
And they're not doing it.
They're not doing it with composting.
Correct.
And because they didn't put an earlier environmental standard with septic systems, now they need to act timely because they're getting sued, and they want to make their life easier and punish everybody.
And after the punishment, it may not even solve the problem. So they're gonna take, let's say, $60 million of equity out of the good citizens in the town of Dartmouth. For what?
Well, they'll say, well, they'll say that the town can spare by going the watershed permit, but again, we don't have.
You can't solve the problem with that.
I'll get to you.
I just keep coming back to 22-year-old data. The report that I read online showed charge
that's something that we keep drilling down on, is that, the age of this, and unfortunately, because of the whole approval of the TMDL where they brushed us aside, this is not the venue for that right now, because what they're doing is they're saying, I guess at a certain point when they try to create a natural resource area, we may be able to bring those arguments back up, but it's not a place I really feel comfortable with, because now you're trying to argue on the science, and probably challenging science in court is going to be a very interesting process as an appeal. I agree with you that this study is outdated, and when you have a community like Dartmouth that was very aggressive with trying to protect the watershed, because we have a groundwater protection district where we source our public drinking water from, and we have a vast area in town where we put regulations on it to protect it that also protect the Slocum River, and that's all being ignored. I agree with you, and there's other aspects that are disingenuous about this whole process. If you watch social media, you see the spamming of the Town of Dartmouth website by the never-ending CSO discharges from the city of New Bedford at CSO number 3 along our shoreline in Clark's Cove.
Yeah.
But we're not focused on that.
Yeah, so
That's 32 million gallons roughly
When
in the
is the
first
rainfall?
5 months of fiscal year 23. So since July 1st, we know about 32 million gallons have discharged from there. There's no nitrogen associated with that discharge going into Buzzards Bay?
It's raw surge. So heavy rain overflow right into the.
And we're focused on your septic system, but not that, or the composting.
So it just seems to me that they've lumped in the South Coast with Cape Cod. Most of the studies are for Cape Cod. They don't have a lot of information and data collection for the South Coast. We're lumped in at the last minute. We need to look at how we can decouple from Cape Cod. All of these towns need to get together and decouple from Cape Cod. This needs additional study. We need more data, and we need to do it methodically. They're not thinking this out. They need to look at how we can implement this in a way that makes sense for the South Coast. And you hit the high nitrogen areas first, and you work your way back. But now, the way that this is being thrown on the septic tank owners, it's a blanket approach, and it's not acceptable.
If the community wants this holistic approach, the overall approach, we're doing this in reverse. It has to start at the legislature. The legislature needs to decide if they want to give municipalities all of the control that's truly needed for the holistic approach. And it'll be interesting to see what comes from that, because you have to look at agriculture, composting, how are we going to really get down to the fertilizer? Maybe looking at 40Bs. 40Bs, once it goes in, it's exempt. So we can't go and impose fertilizer restrictions on a 40B. As long as that's still affordable, that individual property is still exempt. Ma'am, so she was just before you, Mr. McCormick.
In any way, that magical word, that natural resources area, I know the Westport River is not one yet. I don't think the Slocum River is either. Is there any way to get out of that designation so we don't have to abide by this stuff? Because apparently that's like a magic pie in the sky term, and we haven't reached that status yet. Can we not go there? I mean, how can we get out of that term, that natural resources area, where that triggers all of this?
Well, first, I think by making your voice heard. They need to know. Elected officials need to know. Then, if this passes as it promulgates, then our next fight's going to be waiting for this notice to come from Mass DEP that we're going to declare you a natural resource area so that these regs will now engage. There is a hearing process for that. There's an appeal process for that. But like I said earlier, I'm a little worried about being in that arena because it's going to be difficult because it's a The TMDL document is approved by the EPA.
There must be a set of criteria before you are one of the natural resource areas, right? You have to meet some kind of criteria.
Yes, which is really burdensome, and yes, yep. Mr. McCormick was next.
So, just the gentleman up front here, there was a study, right, it's 2012, I did a bunch of research for one of these meetings. It was done by UMass Dartmouth and was fast, and you can go online and find all of these studies. And they did one on Slocum and Little River estuaries, right? And I think the pie chart that you had might have been from that study. But it looks like the same numbers, right? And it does say wastewater, landfill, fertilizer are all regulated things that the Mass DEP can play with, right? And that's why they're targeting it. If you look at the final numbers, they needed to come down by 10%. We have 14% in our septic systems, right? That's a solution. That doesn't need to be the only solution, and that puts all the burden on us. So it's clear that they just took a shot at something they could regulate to fix the problem instead of looking at it holistically, which is what Chris has been talking about.
Exactly.
All along. So I don't think we'll ever get out of the watershed area. It's kind of obvious that we're in the watershed area because we dump water into the rivers into the bay. So that's going to be hard to get out. It would be interesting.
One problem with these proposed regulations that nobody is really catching on to, they're reactive. So we don't engage these regulations if they pass. They don't trigger until there's a problem. So our Little River watershed has a TMDL that shows that it's fine. So the people in the Slocum watershed will have to be doing something. We can continue installing conventional type systems that Mass DEP acknowledges are not protective of that watershed, and we can continue to do it until there's a problem. And then once there's a problem, then the regulations will trigger. Doesn't it make sense to create a proactive rather than reactive set of regulations? And say, listen, maybe from this point forward, we have to do something with all new installs. But again, you know, it's no longer a secret. Mass DEP is just doing this as a response to the lawsuit and nothing else. And there's a gentleman in the back.
Thanks, Chris. John Souza, Fisher Road. I would be remiss without saying, Chris, thank you for sounding the alarm bells on this. And I know you've been working tirelessly for a long time on this, involving our elected officials and public. And I really appreciate that. For all your hard work as a Dartmouth observer. And also, you know, a few other comments. Hearing your presentation, I heard one you came before me on the finance committee. Not quite as in-depth as this. I'm ashamed to say this is my first meeting. I try to get to others. But anyway, the facts I heard tonight, if they are true, and I have no doubt that they are true, quite disturbing that our legislators, or the DEP, is trying to enforce these regulations on us. Your slide, I think, is pertinent that what can we do is contact our elected officials. I think that's critical. You know, we as citizens can, and I think we can write letters to the DEP, and I think we should. But I think the most important thing, and I was happy to see that a select board have recently taken a position on this. A select board have reached out to us, state legislators, Chris Markey and Senator Montigny, and that they've taken a position and they've sent, and you referred to those letters to the DEP. But I'm not sure if our elected officials, our select board, has asked our legislators to lobby the other legislators in this state. DEP, in my opinion, is not going to listen to two legislators. DEP, if they get comments from 50% or more than 50% of our legislators, that if they make these regulations, it's suicide. So we need to be asking our legislators to lobby legislators that they work alongside with to do the same and stop this foolishness. And for the DEP to, if they think this is a real problem, and I think we're all in favor of reducing pollution, that there's probably a better way to doing this. I'm, hate to admit it, I'm a senior citizen now. I'm retired and I'm on a fixed income. I have 2 properties that are in this watershed. I'm hearing figures of $10,000 to $35,000 a system. I can't afford that. Even with an interest-free loan, I still gotta come up with maybe $70,000. And to hear you talk about, and it's all true, we all know that there's not enough installers, there's not enough engineers. How much, that's today's price. What's it gonna be 3 or 4 or 5 years from now when they impose this? What's that price gonna be? I can't do it.
And it's not only the cost up front, but it's an added cost to the individual homeowner forever, because there's electrical costs with these systems, and it's part of my 16-page letter with 27 exhibits, and I'm still working on it. DEP says, yeah, these are very energy-intensive systems. So you've got the operation and maintenance by a Class 2 wastewater treatment plant operator that you have to pay for every year, plus the electricity. So on top of the debt that they say that, we'll give you interest-free loans or low-interest loans to pay for this, you're going to have added debt just to be able to run it. And, I heard at the first public hearing that I attended, a gentleman said, I'm sick of hearing about elders not being able to afford it. They can get a reverse mortgage. And, wow. And I worry about what this is going to do to the public health, because our elders can't afford the debt. Our working households can't afford the debt. Our marginalized households can't afford the debt. Even if it's interest-free, we're going to be looking at decisions between paying that debt or heating your home for hot water or food, high deductible insurance. Those are all impacts on the overall health of the people of Dartmouth. There's a gentleman in the back. I'm sorry. I'll get.
Chris, how about a class action suit so they can come up with a better decision, a better way to do this?
Again, that, I'm here to provide, some technical side of all of this. Any concerns with liability and whatnot that has to get addressed through the select board, the executive board of a city or town. So that, the select board is discussing this on Monday night at their open meeting. And I do also have to apologize a little bit. This is my 3rd session, and I've been writing about this, so I'm a little bit more interrupted than I was in the 1st and the 2nd, so my reruns get a little less stellar. So apologies. There was someone, ma'am, I'll work my way to the front.
The only other concern I have is the idea that this may not even solve the issue, that you can't afford it, you either were retired. This IA system you're saying isn't as effective as it needs to be. There is no system that exists currently. Was that what I heard you say?
That's what I read from their records, yes.
They want us to buy something that to solve a problem, but it's a thing that doesn't solve the problem. We're gonna buy.
They want us to
does
buy
exist.
something that doesn't exist.
It does exist. These systems do exist. I built them. I did the town of Dartmouth. I was involved also in the engineering and design of a large 100 MGD facility, Fuels Point, total nitrogen removal. Done with basically anoxic zones after oxic zones. There's recirculation pumps and special bacteria that will do this. The problem is it's very complex, and these systems do need electrical energy. And you're not going to have a system that's below grade to do this. You have to have access. So they are asking for the septic tank owners something that I think is a blanket approach that doesn't effectively handle the bulk of the nitrogen. It's not studied enough as far as where the bulk of the nitrogen comes from. At the end of the day, it might be just the houses along the riverbanks or the estuaries that are impacting it the most. But when you look at the total nitrogen coming off of compost piles, it's significant. If you look at the treatment plants, and I'm not, it's a trickling filter plant, right, Chris? For the town of Dartmouth?
I think Mr. Barber's in the back of the room. He,
That's
you know,
not
he
a
can
total
speak more.
nitrogen removal plant. So you need these anoxic zones for basically the removal of, say, total nitrogen by extracting oxygen from the nitrate, and then you release nitrogen gas. So, you know, this needs to be done in a methodical, well thought out approach, and there's not enough data to support the approach. That's why I think we've got to take like 10 steps back and take a look at an implementation process that makes sense. You're just throwing this out around the septic tank, there's a blanket approach. It doesn't make any sense.
You know, and just to kind of go back to, you know, what this gentleman was saying about, you know, maybe these systems exist, but they don't exist in Massachusetts in the regulator's mindset. Because in that second line, I just kind of backed up a couple slides. It says, Mass has this rigorous process, and it takes 4.5 to 5 years. So in 2018, soon to be 5 years ago, Mass DEP was in this room. They submitted their draft TMDL. They knew that, you know, they were just going to, you know, just check mark this into an approved document, which would then designate it as impaired. Why weren't they aggressively looking at that time for these systems and to make sure that there were enough of these system approvals to meet whatever this standard is that Mass DEP wants, that they haven't put a number on? And then in the regs, when you read these proposed regs, they kind of have it as a moving finish line. So if they find out that something else does better, they're going to move it a little bit lower and lower and lower and lower. And that becomes a problem because if you create local regulations, then could we be subject to some of the problems that are impacting, like West Tisbury, for example, where they actually create a local reg saying you have to put in an IA system that has a certain removal concentration, that it gets the nitrogen down to a certain level. So this is a completely arbitrary and capricious regulation just based on the best available nitrogen-reducing technology, because it lacks a metric. And because you can't implement these regs, because Mass hasn't approved any of these systems yet, and there aren't enough people to maintain and operate them, further points to arbitrary and capricious regulations on the first aspect of them, which is not something you want to hear when you're a regulator.
These regulations were based on a study done by somebody?
These regulations trigger as a result of a study done by CMAST.
Was the study peer reviewed?
It was reviewed by Mass DEP, and then it went to the public hearing. After the public hearing, it went to the EPA for approval.
So it wasn't peer reviewed by another professional organization?
I am unaware of
Accuracy of the-
I am unaware of any third-party scientific peer reviewer.
They weren't cherry picking the data to get to a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any in the process. So
You should go on the website and look at them. You can see them all. It does say on the Mass DEP that there's 3 experimental systems that are approved, and it's worth going on the website and taking a look at the pictures when you click on the companies. These are big tanks that are going to be in your yard. Big tanks. Above ground.
Oh, my Lord.
So they would take a look.
there was someone in the back. Someone in the back had a question? No?
Chris, is your slide deck going to be on the town website?
It will. So sorry it's a little blurry due to the light and all, maybe also the projector, but absolutely we will upload this tomorrow. And our earlier presentations are available as well on DCTV, our website, and again, you know, trying to do the same thing a third time, but keeping it a little bit different, you know, a little bit more awkward for me, so apologies.
general comment. By the way, I live in Genuine Way up off of Highland Avenue. I've talked to a bunch of my neighbors. All of them thought that none of this mattered because it was only when you sold your house. I'm telling you, it's been a huge disinformation. How many townspeople, go talk to people, how many people realize that this is gonna impact them immediately, right out of your pocket? Very few. And not when you sell your house.
Chris, would it make more sense, rather than individual letters, to have a petition that were drafted by an expert that cited all of the areas that you're talking about that cause this, that suggest that this is not a valid or reasonable proposal, and then have that signed by so many people that were willing, in other words, one particular petition rather than, or in addition to individual letters, shall I say?
Yeah, you know, from a strategic standpoint of trying to attack the study,
Well, yeah.
I don't think we have any merits on that. From where we are, we're in a public hearing process, and we have to attack these regulations on their merits. And it's only when you get to this, you know, the natural resource area designation that perhaps some arguments may be able to arise at that time, and those arguments would, you know, maybe have to rely on some more recent test results or even some observations if there was, by some chance, some restoration that occurred in the nearly 20 years since this study was done.
So in the absence of any pushback on this, what's the timeline for implementation?
So there is pushback that can happen because, you know, one of the things that, you know, you can do is email DEP, make sure officials, and I'm saying, you know what, spread the wealth around. You know, if you email Mr. Markey and any other elected officials, you can email me too. You know, I like to hear people's input. Not every, you know.
CC is easy.
So, you know, I hear other people's input. It might formulate, you know, differences of opinions, changes of opinion. But DEP and officials need to hear from all of you if you're concerned. If you rely on someone else, we're in trouble. The only reason why we got this extension is because DEP is getting a lot of pushback, and they're realizing that, you know, this is pretty fatal with how fast they're pushing this, with how clandestine they've been, and the lack of transparency on this. And if you feel as though that Mass DEP's secrecy about this whole process is disturbing, that really needs to be emphasized. If you're concerned that the foot soldiers of this, you and the municipalities who are going to bear the brunt of all this, either as the taxpayer, the homeowner who faces option one, or the taxpayer who faces the uncertainty and the liability on the tax base of option two, who could also get one of these IA requirements on them by the town, make that concern known. DEP needs to hear about that. They needed to have municipalities at the table, and they didn't. So if you rely on everybody else, you know, it can be just an email, couple sentences, couple paragraphs. You know, what do you expect from Massachusetts in its service to you to protect the environment, but also come up with a reasonable set of regulations by which we protect the environment?
Are you in talks with your counterparts in other South Coast towns?
I have been. For many, I was talking to actually one today on the other side of Mount Hope Bay. That isn't even being looked at, that has estuaries within it, which is kind of weird how the MEP is looking at a very targeted area of estuaries in this low tidal flushing zone. They haven't even looked on the other side of Mount Hope Bay. They haven't looked at Clark's Cove yet. It's just interesting to see how they've been selective with this. But I have been. I was actually talking to one up in Plymouth County today that's somewhat inland. So we've been you know, talking about this extensively. Sir.
Chris, can you speak to any other contaminants that aren't on the current focus of these regulations and where the DEP is not speaking to them yet, or where they may go on it? And then I would remind everybody, Title V is the law of the land in Massachusetts. So again, as Chris just mentioned, it's targeted right now at the South Coast, Cape and the islands, but there's nothing stopping these regulations from being enforced and mandated upon Western Mass communities, Central Mass communities. If you could speak to that, and then if I could just have a minute to come up there just so I can get
Sure.
on the microphone, I'd like to just give some comments.
So I think what everybody in the Commonwealth needs to realize is that Mass DEP has been reactive about addressing those constituents, what makes up our wastewater, those ingredients, that conventional septic systems are not good at removing. So if they wait for those other contaminants to become a problem, to then get sued, they're going to be doing that to you out in Western Mass or Central Mass, because guess what? Now you've got a pond with blue-green algae, and they're coming after you next, and they're going to do it quickly. We know that there are other contaminants like phosphorus that is a concern in more inland areas, and that's not even being talked about at this time. So the longer DEP waits, the more reactionary they'll be when the time comes. So, you know, hopefully we can have more accountability to DEP in the future with respects to this aspect of DEP. There are good parts of DEP. You know, this is something that's very concerning. It's very disappointing of their performance here in Dartmouth. But, you know, I point to all of the great work that they're doing for our residents in Bliss Corner in that study area. They're doing an extraordinary job. So don't let, you know, all of this frustration that's occurring as a result of a dilatory wastewater section and them not merging and saying, wait a second here, we got to deal with the solid waste on this with the deregulation of composting and its impacts on groundwater. Let's not let that overshadow the great work that's happening in Bliss Corner by John Handrahan and Lori Williamson and the EPA as well. So yeah, so they, you know what? If you're sitting back watching us get overtaken by these regulations, you know, I just think to World War II with Poland, you're next, elsewhere in Massachusetts. So, you want to address? Sure.
Thank you. Just want to make sure. My name's Chris Fay. I'm a resident of Dartmouth. I'm also a licensed professional civil engineer by trade. I've got an educational background on environmental engineering with a concentration in hydrology and water resources, along with geotechnical engineering. That's the science of soils, also groundwater flow. So that background that I have gives me a little bit of a unique experience and insight into what's going on here, but 99% of the public just doesn't have that knowledge. And that therein lies the problem with how accelerated this process has been. And it's deeply concerning as an engineer and also as a taxpayer of the Commonwealth. My expertise actually is in the transportation arena for civil engineering, so have the education on that side of stuff that I've talked about, but the regulatory process is a component of civil engineering as well as local governments, and this process has been really deeply, deeply flawed. I want to thank Chris again. He's been the tip of the spear in town here, raising awareness of this, working with our other local leaders. It's important. This is a issue that affects us all. There hasn't been one comment that I've heard at the public hearings that I've attended where anyone is against clean water. We all want clean water, we deserve clean water, and so do future generations. However, we've got a long way to go in terms of increasing awareness of this critical and time-sensitive issue, and we absolutely need an engaged public throughout Massachusetts, especially here in town. We really need folks to step up, engage on this, send your comments in, keep educating yourself on this topic, call the Board of Health if you need information. If you're not even from Dartmouth, you may have some folks here that aren't from Dartmouth because this was opened up to neighboring communities as well. Reach out to your public officials, understand what the position is of your town. I encourage you to copy the entire Massachusetts legislature, not just our local delegation. I'm preparing a list right now, going through the Mass Senate and representatives to collate a list that can be copied and pasted into emails. And I'll share that with the Board of Health. I'm not on Facebook or anything like that, so getting that information out, I'm going to hopefully work with the town to help other residents with that. Just bear with me a couple more minutes here. So Dartmouth and other affected Massachusetts communities on the South Coast were clearly not given a seat at the table. And this has been a very non-transparent process that lacks any stakeholder engagement on the municipal level. That's important. We rely on our municipal leaders to govern. That's just not how government and government agencies should work. In fact, that's a prime example of government at its worst. It's operating in a vacuum, and it's not giving the public or its elected representatives or appointed representatives the proper opportunity to voice their concerns for local citizens. We need more time as a community to raise awareness of this issue. We've got a packed house here. There's only about 35, 40 people. We've had similar turnout at the previous 2 public hearings that have held in town, and I know we have folks tuning in from DCTV. But I'll tell you, I've called on, at the previous public comment period that I attended down in Barnstable with others, I've called on Mass DEP to pause this process for several months, not 5 to 6 weeks. Keep the public comment period open so citizens can be engaged in a timely manner. The time extension granted by DEP for public comment has been disingenuous as it relates to the overall process. They're simply not acknowledging the shortcomings of this process and how weighted it was towards Cape Cod versus here on the South Coast. There's also no acknowledgement of the lack of stakeholder engagement on the South Coast, and that's pretty evident. So we need more common sense solutions that don't impose significant government mandated debt on the taxpayers. And a regulatory agency should not have the power to impose this level of debt on us, like what's at stake here. There should be a legislative component so our elected leaders can speak on our behalf. The timing of these critical public hearings is also suspect. These studies have been going on for a long time, and this has been debated on the Cape. When I was in college over 20 years ago, I remember this being almost like a case study in the wastewater design class I had, talking about Cape Cod and some of the pollution. This is not news to them, but it is news to the South Coast. Therein lies the problem. We don't have print newspaper like we did back in the 80s and 90s. You've got a fire hose of information that's coming at you in a digital world, and you've got little nuggets of information. The press has really just started to pick up on this in a good way over the last few weeks, but I've even seen some of the reports that are just inaccurate, where, as one resident said, there was actually a statement that said, this is only going to affect residents that are selling their home or perhaps upgrading their system, or if there's a failed system in place. That's just not the case. This is a one-size-fits-all approach where we're all going to get caught in this fight. So, unfortunately, there's widespread financial implications at stake here. I think DEP should have done a major public relations campaign to raise awareness of this, such as a mailer. Snail mail could have worked in a situation like this versus word of mouth. Not a lot of folks go onto town websites, get engaged on that level. And again, the time of year. We had 6 days from the first verbal public comment meeting to the third one. This all happened right after Thanksgiving. Is that coincidental? I don't think so. So, these changes are also being proposed when we have a once-in-a-generation inflation issue. People are struggling out there, and that hits people across all income levels. Sharp rise in energy prices, again, as someone said, these systems would have an energy component to them. They'd be mechanical. They would require a lot of upkeep, and as well as that reoccurring cost for energy on them. To add more to the current burden that citizens are facing right now, I find that personally to be unacceptable. Cape Cod is a lot different than us. So the Cape experiences a lot of usage from year-round residents, of course, but they also have a seasonal component down there where there's a lot of rental properties. I've been down there with friends, family, where you get a lot of people packing into a house for a weekend or a week. So you have a very disproportionate loading on that septic system down there, and not all of them, but a good chunk of them, than what we do have here on the residential level. So there's also a very different dynamic in terms of the geology that the Cape has, as well as geology and soil conditions. Bob Almy, who chairs our Public Works Board, has given some excellent commentary at the previous public hearings in town. He's 45 years of experience as a geologist. I look forward to talking to him soon on this. He's worked with groundwater issues on the Cape. He's got some experience on the West Coast. He's a subject matter expert, and I think he's going to be a great resource to the town going forward. Soil permeability is something you're going to hear in these discussions. Easily said, that's a technical term for the soil's ability to transmit groundwater. So down the Cape, it's generally very sandy. You're surrounded by Cape Cod Bay, Buzzards Bay, Atlantic Ocean. The groundwater is moving very quickly down there compared to the glacial till that we have around these parts. So the question that was raised, how long does that contaminant north of Route 6 take to get to the Slocum? You'd have to really do a very scientific study to determine that. And there's a lot of boxes that haven't been checked when it comes to looking for this data. Our neighbors in Westport right now have regulations that currently require IA systems in a proactive fashion for new systems, for new construction, or replacement of existing systems that may fail. But this quote-unquote best available technology doesn't define performance characteristics. So again, how much of the contaminant are you looking to remove from your wastewater? I fear for a lot of friends in Westport that may have this system in place, that their investment that's been made proactively as mandated by their town, they may get the bad news that they're really on the hook for future investments. That slide that Chris put up, quote unquote, with current technology, it appears that the use of IA systems alone would not meet the required nitrogen reductions. That floors me as an engineer, and it really should floor anyone. To have the investment go out there and not know that you're going to get the return on it, I really have a difficult time believing that a regulatory agency would make such an ambiguous statement. That's not what we do in engineering. That's not what we do in the sciences. That's bogus in my eyes. So instead of identifying more common sense solutions that are equitable for all nitrogen contributors, this feels like the citizens of Dartmouth and the South Coast that are on septic are purely a scapegoat for the Conservation Law Foundation lawsuit. There have been ongoing water quality studies that are cited tonight, going back decades. We're dealing with old data. Instead of incrementally tackling this issue by imposing new regulations on new construction and replacement of failed systems, and that's something DEP could have done 20 years ago. We've had several building booms during that time, and they haven't done anything to regulate to that regard and to be a proactive agency. They're purely reactive in this sense. That would have made too much sense, you know? It really just baffles me. So they want to see timely action on nitrogen reduction. However, nitrogen-rich runoff from agricultural, and I love our farmers, I love our farms, we live on the farm coast, it's a special place that we have here. But they have skin in this game. That wastewater that's on site running from surface runoff, that could be treated in an engineered fashion to eliminate that contributor. Same thing for these for-profit composting facilities. This was deregulated with not one care of what the long-term implications is going to be on this. And my understanding is the for-profit composting rolls up under the protections of agriculture. You know, it's the golden cow, quote unquote. And again, I'm not trying to pin this on any one entity, but it's got to be an equitable approach where a whole of government comes together, a community comes together, finds solutions that don't put the burden squarely on the back of septic owners, or, as Chris had mentioned, you know, it's going to create a scenario where, you know, septic owners are going to be like pitchfork and torch at town hall and say, we've got to go to the watershed permit option. Yet it's a holistic way of doing things that doesn't have a guaranteed outcome. So, you know, one of the biggest issues, Chris touched on this, and I'm a fisherman. I'm a conservationist at heart as well. One of the things that really bothered me before this even came on my radar, and I'm a news junkie, and I only heard about this thing a few weeks ago, is the New Bedford CSO issue, combined sewer overflow. Cities like New Bedford, Fall River, Providence have combined pipes underground that take raw sewage from homes, and that mixes with the stormwater that comes when it rains. Your catch basins drain into these pipe networks. More modern designs separate those two flows so that sewage just can go into its own pipe, and then you've got stormwater, and that can be treated as well. During our first verbal public comment meeting on the 30th of November, we had a rain event. It was about 3/4 of an inch of rain. We had 920,000 gallons of CSO discharge into Clark's Cove. You've probably seen Dartmouth Today articles that have talked about the shellfish beds shut down and whatnot. I go fishing out of Paden, and I bring dinner home for my family from my catch out there. There's times where I've got to go to different ports or go to Rhode Island to fish or whatever, because I don't want to be fishing right outside where there's just 920,000 gallons. Last week it was 1.4 million gallons of CSO discharge. This is one pipe. There's many of them. They're throughout New Bedford Harbor. They're impacting the Acushnet area. It's disgusting, and they're on a consent decree. They're under some kind of a permit where long-term there's no solution. Fall River, they were mandated to put in basically a large labyrinth of underground tunnels, of which this combined stormwater and sewage can be set into this tunnel system, and then they can treat it at the plant in the fashion that the plant can handle it in a capacity. So if the plant can only do 1,000 gallons an hour, and that's a very low number, but you've got 2,000 gallons coming on the pipeline, that other 1,000 gallons, that's going right into the bay in New Bedford right now. In a place like Fall River and Providence, these are massive $100+ million investments. That combined flow is stored underground, and then it's brought into the plant at the rate in which it can treat it. It's crazy that in this day and age that we have a major city alongside of Dartmouth that is just allowed to keep going on, yet they have no skin in this game. Let's pin it on the septic owner and all these other things that you see in the pie chart for nitrogen contributors. So, local impacts here in town, I'm in Fire District 2. Fire District 2 headquarters had underseen a lot of upgrades over the last several years. That's on septic. So my understanding is that that would be right in the crosshairs in terms of needing upgrades on it. Everyone in the fire district would be sharing that burden. I think we might even have a library in town that has that as well. So it's a difficult process. It's extremely rushed at the tail end. And this goes beyond a 5-week pause in public comment. We need our elected leaders to get through, as well as the citizen voice, to get through to these stakeholders at the state level, to not just delay this process by 5 weeks. This really needs a pause. If you, as someone said, decouple us from the Cape. The Cape, it appears to be an acute problem, but they've known about it a long time. We don't have well-informed citizens in this area. That's going to take a little bit more time to gain momentum, as well as we need an objective review of this data, and we need to look at it through a different set of lens and try to find other solutions. In conclusion, based on my experience with this whole process, I have lost faith in Mass DEP's ability to function without increased oversight in their wastewater sector. I'm calling on the Mass Legislature to investigate Mass DEP's procedural failures during this important regulatory process and have public hearings where the public can hear testimony from Mass DEP leadership, including the section chief, who should answer for allowing such a flawed process to proceed while being asleep at the helm for over 2 decades, when they've been tasked with being the stewards of clean air, clean land, and clean water. They've known about this issue for a long time, but they failed to complete their mission, and now they're in a reactive posture in response to a lawsuit. They've failed the Commonwealth, and they want you to shoulder the burden for their shortcomings. That's not going to happen in Dartmouth without a fight, but we all need to chip in on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So you might have heard a lot of comments from me about concerns about either process. That's what we do here in Dartmouth. We don't just look at things ahead to say this is what we want to do and not think about the unintended consequences, but that's what DEP is doing. So please do not take any of these comments to mean that this is way, it seems like he's favoring this way or that way over the other. If these regulations promulgate, these will be decisions that are made ultimately by your elected officials. And elected officials at this time, local elected officials, we don't know when they're going to designate us as a natural resource area. So to talk about it now as to what the town may want to do is premature, because if it takes us 5 years, you could have a different executive board. And one board cannot bind another board, because you can't say, hey, select board or board of health and select board, that other board 5 years ago said that they were interested in going this way. We don't know what the composition of our elected officials will be when the time may come if these regulations pass. So we want to make sure that everyone is fully aware of the consequences that are not intended by these regulations that will be borne on the backs of the people and the town. We will be providing a exhaustive comment letter that we will be releasing in early January for everyone to see. We may end up doing another comment letter following their January 17th informational sessions, depending upon how they decide to sell this proposal to you all. Because I am confident that what I put in writing, I'm basing it off of fact and our internal discussions. And you can approach me and find me anytime right here in the town hall, 8:30 to 4:30, Monday through Friday, unless by some chance I was off. Go find them. So they don't want to deliver their records. They don't want to allow us to participate. So now is your time to make your voice heard. And I want to just thank everyone. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you want to talk to me one-on-one, happy to stay behind. But, thank you for coming out. Thank you for your interest in this. And please don't let this, fade away. Keep up the interest. We have, a long time between now and the 30th. Talk to your friends, talk to your neighbors, talk to your family members, talk to people in other areas that think they're fine. Because like I said, hey, phosphorus is a bigger problem inland, and they may be coming after you next when they get sued for not doing their job. Thank you.